And some studies have shown in recent years that when people are in love, there are elevated levels of dopamine and other hormones. And so there are actually physical chemical changes that occur in the brain when one falls in love. Now, an interesting thing is researchers at first thought that they would find the brain waves of people in love would look like people suffering from obsessive compulsive disorder. And what they actually found is when they do these brain scans, PET scans and MRIs and so forth, that the brain patterns of people in love, deeply in love, look more like coke addicts than they do like obsessive compulsives. And so perhaps there's this addictive quality to love as well that evolved to help us form pair bonds. Now, monogamy is the exception in cultures around the world rather than the rule. Most cultures allow some form of polygamy, of multiple spouses. And let me make a clarification here about the terminology that we're using. Polygamy is the overarching term, and it means having more than one spouse. A man having more than one wife, or a woman having more than one husband. In anthropology, we use two more precise terms. Polygyny, which refers to a man having more than one wife. Polygyny, a man having more than one wife. And polyandry, which is when a woman has more than one husband. Both polygyny and polyandry are forms of polygamy. Now, polygyny is very common around the world. About 82% of the world's societies allow men to have more than one wife. But, on the other hand, polyandry is extremely rare. We only know 6 or 7 cases. Less than 1% of the cultures that have been sampled in the world practice polyandry. It's extremely rare, and it seems to be most closely associated with extreme environmental conditions. The best known example is of the ethnic Tibetans living in Nepal. A very rough environment. 12,000 feet above sea level. Most of the families are poor and have very little cultivatable land. And they practice a very specific form of polyandry in which brothers share a single wife. And this is called fraternal polyandry, when brothers share a single wife. Now, why might this be? They live in this harsh environment, not a ton of land to go around, and fraternal polyandry keeps land together. These men are marrying the same woman so they can all farm the same land. They compose a single household. And 2, it reduces the rate of reproduction. Women are limited in the number of children that they can have in their lifetime. And if one woman has several husbands, the absolute rate of reproduction will be very low. Now, marriage is generally considered to be a human universal. People in all cultures bond with members of the opposite sex. But there are a few exceptions, and actually the exception that might prove the rule in this case is a group called the Nayar, and we find them in southwest India. And they're the example that's often held up to show that marriage is not universal. But even among the Nayar, we find bonding between men and women, something that looks a lot like marriage and is very important to their culture. Now, the Nayar are matrilineal. They're a matrilineal society. The core of the household is a brother and sister, or brothers and sisters. And they will live together and have their lands and their house in common. And traditionally, the Nayar have been a very warlike society. The men are warriors. They would go off for long periods of time and fight, and then come back periodically to their own households. Now, among the Nayar, we find 2 forms of what we can call marriage. The first is called the Tali rite, and this is basically a rite of passage, a puberty rite, a coming-of-age ceremony for girls, much more so for girls than boys. So when a girl is somewhere between the ages of 7 and 12, very often prepubescent, before she's begun her menstrual cycle, she will marry a man who lives in the same village and who's been selected by her parents. But this man should be from another matrilineage. They will cohabitate for a few days. The man has the right to have sex with this wife, but they don't always do it. Especially if the girl is very young, the man will not have sex with the wife. But once the girl has gone through this cohabitation, whether she's had sex or not, before she goes through it, she's a girl. And when she comes out, she's a full woman. She's a real woman in Nayar society. And in fact, is called by the term that they use for women, the honorific term for women. This marriage, this Tali rite marriage, might only last for 3, 4, 5 days, but it's an important part of making girls into women. Now afterwards, when a girl gets older, she's going to have very little to do with this first husband, this Tali rite husband. There are a few points in the life cycle where they have to get back together and the husband will give certain ritual gifts to his wife. But for the most part, this is a 3 to 5 day marriage, if you will, and then it ends there. But afterward, when the girl gets older, she can enter into another form of marriage, which we call sanbanham marriages. And these are marriages based on mutual consent. They're not arranged marriages. And they also have this serial quality. Sanbanham husbands are also called visiting husbands. And what they'll do is after dinner, and you'll remember that men are living with their sisters in their family household, a man will leave his home after dinner, go to his Sanbanham wife, put his spear in front of the doorway to let other people know that he's there. He'll spend the night with his wife and then leave the next morning and go back to his sister's house where he'll eat and have breakfast. Now, a woman can have various Sanbanham marriages at one time, up to 20, for example. And most women have 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 10. 20 is very unusual, but they can have multiple Sanbanham marriages at the same time. In some ways, these are very casual relationships, and they can be terminated without any legal recourse, and people don't seem to really get upset. They can be ended by mutual consent in that way. The visiting husbands, Sanbanham husbands, will give things to their wives, some cooking oil, maybe a little bit of money, not too much, but a little bit to help them get by in their everyday lives. The women don't depend on their husbands for their survival, but it's a nice little extra bit that they give them. The crucial thing occurs when a woman gets pregnant. Every child has to have a father in Nayar society. Paternity has to be acknowledged. But if a woman has 8 Sanbanham husbands, for example, how does she know who the father is? We can always be sure of maternity, but we can never, at least in the days before DNA testing, we can never be absolutely sure of paternity. And what happens is one of the husbands has to step up to the plate and claim to be the father of this child. And often a lot of negotiation goes on between the women and her Sanbanham husbands, getting them to claim paternity in this case. So marriage among the Nayar is not exclusive. The couples don't cohabitate. It's a very different form of marriage than our own form. However, it's very important. This form of marriage, both the Tali rite and the Sanbanham, are very important in Nayar society. And it's important to validate paternity, to show who the father of a child is. And this is a common thread in marriage in cultures throughout the world, claiming paternity. Now, I'd like to move on at this point and talk just a bit about incest. Incest is based around rules of exogamy. Exogamy is marrying outside of a particular group, and endogamy. Endogamy is marrying within a particular group. One of the universal taboos found in cultures around the world is a prohibition against incest, against having sexual relationships or marrying some category of kin. Somebody you have to marry outside of a given group. You have to marry exogamously. But the rub is, what that category of kin is changes and varies significantly from society to society. In our own culture, whom one can marry varies from state to state. First cousin marriage is prohibited in most states, I believe all states. And in some states, second cousin marriage is prohibited as well. Although not that long ago, there were a lot of first and second cousin marriages, even in our own culture. Now, interestingly, we generally take an incest, a revulsion about incest, to be natural. It's disgusting. Why would anybody want to do that? It's just one of those perversities of everyday life. But, as I said, the range of what we consider to be incestuous has changed over time. The universal prohibition against incest is just with one's siblings, one's parents, and one's children. So just the basic nuclear family, what we would consider to be the nuclear family. This is the universal prohibition.